now we can move on to our next roundtable session, which is preservation education and the role of local and regional context. So in this roundtable, the speakers will compare and contrast experiences across different programs, both in terms of educational strategies and the practice of graduates once they leave the program. So whether historic preservation education should be contextual or global is a question that the speakers here aim to answer. Introducing the speakers for the session, we have Mehar Hadighi. Mehar is an assistant professor of architecture and the director of historic preservation and design at Texas Tech University. He received his PhD in architecture from Penn State, his MA in historic preservation planning from Cornell, and his professional Master of Architecture degree from Azad University in Tehran. As a practitioner, researcher, and educator, Mehar concentrates on modernism, understood in relation to historical and contemporary contexts. In particular, he documents local adaptations of modern architecture, which he then analyzes via computational design methodologies in order to preserve them as characteristic of place and to consider them for additional locales and purposes. Joining Mehar, we have Emily Goldman. Emily teaches data analytics at Mercy College in Dobbs Ferry, New York. She has an MA in historic preservation planning and a PhD in city and regional planning from Cornell University. For her dissertation, she studied a modern preservation movement in Brooklyn, NY, and has worked at the NYC Landmarks Preservation Commission. She loves exploring historic areas and the people who inhabit them. And last but not the least, we have Douglas Appler. He is the chair and the associate professor in the Department of Historic Preservation at the University of Kentucky. He also serves as the director of graduate studies for the Department of Historic Preservation. Doug's research explores innovation in the treatment of historic structures through public policy, with a particular emphasis on the actions of local government. Doug holds a PhD in city and regional planning from Cornell University and a master's in urban and regional planning from Virginia Tech, and also a bachelor's of arts in history and political science, again from Virginia Tech. So on this note, I think, Mehar, I'll hand it over to you. Yeah.
Emily, do you want to start for the next slide? Yeah. So I'm gonna say something at the beginning, and then maybe Emily and Doug will continue. So I think what at least I think about our discussion today is not necessarily asking a question or answering this question: should HP education be contextual, and if yes, to what extent? Is more to raise questions that may lead us to a better way to do preservation education, or to think about preservation education in a broader way. I think we started this symposium with the same idea with last night's keynote lecture and also today's discussion. I think when we talk about context and when we talk about historic preservation, there are many questions that come to mind, and we want to not necessarily again answer these questions, but start a discussion on this. And I think we would be happy to engage everyone in a discussion, especially at the end. Emily, now do you want to?
Okay, let's go to the next slide here. Hi everybody. Angela, thank you so much for that lovely introduction to all of us. These are the three people who we're speaking to today. I guess we will just pretty much jump into the first question that we prepared as a roundtable discussion. So for the, but actually, sorry, I misspoke. Before we get into the first question, because we are talking about context, and maybe the first thing that might come to mind when people are thinking about context in preservation, they're going to be thinking about sort of the local, regional, architectural, geographic context of one's environment. That is basically how we're interpreting that word. We figured it would be important to just set the stage for what context we have all worked, taught, or studied in, just so that we can kind of keep building this landscape across this whole symposium of where HPP alumni have lived, worked, studied, because it's just so fascinating to hear of all these places that people have been in. So, I mean, even just from the last presentation, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, India, Buffalo, Indiana, Colorado, and sorry if I missed any, the list just kind of keeps going. And that was just from your guys' last presentation. So it's quite fascinating just knowing where all these people have been and lived and worked and studied. And because preservation is so powerfully place-based, we wanted to just continue that discussion a little bit. So from my experience, has been rather on the more limited side. I've kind of bounced back and forth a number of times between New York City and Ithaca, for better or worse. But I, of course, did my HPP and my PhD in Ithaca. And then I had two significant work experiences in New York City. So the first was at the Landmarks Preservation Commission, where at least one of the current preservation students is going to be interning this summer. And then after my PhD, I worked for a nonprofit organization also in New York City. And we were based in a government office doing some creative urban policy type work. So it wasn't preservation per se, but it was a great fit coming out of the PhD program for other reasons. It worked out well for a number of years. And then just recently, just in this past January, I took a position teaching at a local college also in New York, Dobbs Ferry, New York, which is about half an hour north of the city. And I'm actually sort of at the moment teaching the technical skills that I started to develop back during my HPP degree, which was when I took my first GIS class. And so I'm teaching data analytics, as Angela mentioned. That being said, spent a lot of time in New York State. Now, it is a great state. I mean, let's be clear about that. But so that's a lot of where I'm coming from in terms of my context. However, I'm currently and have also spent a lot of time, been very lucky to do so in New Orleans, Louisiana. That was where I did my summer internship during my HPP degree as well. So New Orleans is another city that I feel I can very much sort of speak to and that kind of thing. So that's a little bit about me and the context that I've worked in, and we'll have the others talk to you about that too.
Sure, I'm happy to go next if that suits everybody. Doug Appler, originally from New Hampshire, born and raised in New Hampshire. Went to undergrad in the first round of grad school at Virginia Tech, so got a little bit of exposure to a slightly different part of the country in that sense. Did 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala, which again is a very different cultural context. And came back to Blacksburg to finish off the master's degree in planning there. Then worked in Georgia for a few years, first in Atlanta, working for the Atlanta Regional Commission, and then in Madison County, whose biggest claim to fame was that it was the third largest producer of poultry in the state of Georgia. So had that going for it. And then from there, went to Ithaca and started and completed the PhD, working with Michael and with Shireen and with Kathy Gleason, and then was lucky enough to wind up getting a position at the University of Kentucky as a visiting professor, and have made that work pretty well for me since. But yeah, so it's basically been up and down the East Coast with a pretty significant diversion to Guatemala for a couple of years. Had a little bit of exposure to the dissertation topic was understanding the community benefits of city archaeology programs. And so had a chance to work with really some profoundly capable and talented and really inspiring folks in Alexandria, Virginia for a couple of summers there. Pam Cressy, who was the first city archaeologist there, and have since kind of moved on to urban renewal and kind of trying to understand urban renewal. That was kind of what I had thought was going to be my initial just sort of getting to know Kentucky research, was just sort of trying to understand how Kentucky participated in the federal urban renewal program. And that has sort of just been what I've kept on doing over the last few years. I had one incredible summer where I got to live in Greenbelt, Maryland, and just go to the National Archives every day. And that was my, got a little grant to do that. And I've been mining that data for really the last 8 years. It's just, if you actually get time to go do research for 2 months at a stretch, it's amazing what you can do if you actually try to do it. So that's been a lot of fun for me, and I've gone way farther down this rabbit hole than really I ever expected, but I'm still enjoying it. So that's more or less my experience at the moment. So I'll hand it off.
Thank you, Doug and Emily. I think my experience and my understanding of context is a little bit different than Doug and Emily, coming from a totally different culture and background from Iran. So I was born and raised in Iran, in a city in northern part of Iran near the Caspian Sea. So it was a coastal city, but it was a small city. For architecture school, I moved to metropolitan area in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran. Totally different context. And I studied architecture, and I learned very quickly that although in architecture schools, we work with kind of plain paper and start designing from scratch, in reality, you need to work with the context, especially learning and working in a country with 2,000, 3,000 years of architectural history. So I learned a lot about the context and about the way in which you need to think about the context while doing architecture. And quickly I understood that, okay, so I'm fascinated with that environment, with that culture, with the context. So why not trying to preserve it? And I ended up working in a couple of architectural projects in the firm that I was working, interning first and then working. And quickly understood that I'm interested in preservation. And my job at that time was in a way that the office was working more in an urban scale or like neighborhood scale. So I got interested in not only preservation of artifacts and architecture, but preservation of kind of a neighborhood and urban area. So I did my research, and I found out that Cornell might be the best place for me to continue my study. And I did my HPP program at Cornell in 2010 to 2012, and worked both with Michael and Jeff. And then my wife got, so my wife went to UVA in Virginia to study architecture. She got her professional degree in architecture in UVA, and therefore I moved to Virginia, and I started teaching courses related to architecture and urban planning, more in terms of world history in Virginia, both in James Madison University and in Virginia Commonwealth University. And then I thought that it might be a good idea for me to go back to school, and I went to Penn State to get my PhD. And I kind of worked at the intersection of preservation and architecture and design and computation. And similar to Doug, I was very lucky that coming out of my PhD program, I was offered a position at Texas Tech, and I started teaching at Texas Tech. And in terms of context, it was another cultural change for me when I moved from Pennsylvania to Texas. So moving from New York to Virginia and Pennsylvania wasn't that much of a difference for me, but moving to Texas was a totally different situation. So this is my part of setting the stage. Emily, maybe you want to go to the next slide. So the first kind of sub-question that we're asking is, when we talk about whether HP education should be contextual, is there really an alternative? And Emily, I think you missed one slide, and this is the second question, which is fine. We can do this first and then go back to the first question. So what do we mean when we talk about context for historic preservation education? Geography, architecture, design, culture, climate, what else? So coming to Texas, I learned many things about the history of Mexican Americans. And I learned, I think Trudy last night mentioned that the building is a building, but the people is the thing that makes that building interesting and subject of preservation for us. And I quickly learned in Texas that we need to know about the history of Mexican culture and Mexican American and learn about the culture in order to be able to preserve anything, including buildings. So basically, this idea of contextual preservation or contextual education in preservation came to my mind when I moved to Cornell. When I moved to Texas, not the time that I moved to Cornell. I mean, you may guess that when I moved from Iran to the United States and to study at Cornell, this was a big difference for me, and I should have got this idea over there, but not really. So when I was at Cornell, I think working with barns was a really hit topic in historic preservation, at least at Cornell, maybe because of Michael. But of course, barns were kind of everywhere. However, when I went to Texas, I found out that there are not many barns over there. So people, students, architects, everyone were talking about the adobe construction, especially mission churches that were along the El Camino Real, the way in which Mexicans came to the United States. And that pathway that El Camino Real actually going from El Paso. So El Paso was the first city in the United States that this path came to the northern part of the North America. So being in El Paso, my idea of context and its relation to the preservation education changed. And then I discussed this with Emily and Doug, and they said that this sounds an interesting idea. So we decided to talk about this in this roundtable. So geography, architecture, design, culture, climate are all part of the this context. But for me, I think people, the users, and those are the most important thing in terms of the context that we're talking about. And this is not only the people of that area that makes that culture, makes that architecture, makes that context, but also the students who are the subject of our talk today. So I'll stop here and let the others continue this.
Sure. I think when you first kind of floated this idea, it sounded like it would be an interesting topic to discuss with the group, just because it is in a lot of ways what, it's what draws a lot of us to preservation in the first place, is understanding those differences in context and trying to understand the stories that make different places unique or make them similar and give them connections to other places as well. And so I think when we talk about, particularly talk about context in relation to preservation education, I think, and this may reappear in one of the slides that we've got here coming up in a little bit, but how that idea of understanding where the local context, the context of your local program, or the local context of the program where you teach, how that influences what you can teach and what types of materials you have available to teach with, the different people that you'll be able to communicate with in order to engage in preservation education. All those are influenced, all those basically define the context for your program and for what you teach. And so really it's kind of a core entity or core part of what we teach as preservationists, I think.
Yeah, I very much agree. When I first heard of this topic, what immediately came to mind was when I started to work at the Landmarks Commission after the HPP degree. And some of my strongest memories from the HPP degree would be just, roaming around Ithaca with my very small class. We only had 3, but noticing every single feature of every building that we saw and being able to give them a name, which was new vocabulary for me, certainly. I had been a history major and whatnot. One of my classmates was an architecture student, or was an architect prior to the program, so she may have been more familiar with all this new terminology about buildings. But for me, it was very new, and we would just be noticing everything that we saw. And we became super familiar with the local context of Ithaca and the types of buildings and the things that you see on these buildings. And then Binghamton, we did our survey class there, and spent so much time just documenting every single feature of every building in this one large district in Binghamton that again, you become very familiar with that sort of vocabulary. And when I started working at the Landmarks Commission, which happened before I even defended my thesis, actually, they needed me to start really fast after I had graduated. So I just kind of literally drove down to New York on June 30th and started on July 1st. But all this new terminology was all of a sudden, around, and I didn't even know what these things were. Bluestone sidewalk, I hadn't heard of that before, I don't think. Or, brownstone, that type of brownstone building that, makes Brooklyn, brownstone Brooklyn, so they say. So all these, some very, that was very much part of the local vocabulary and the, even the sort of the mythology of New York City architecture, but it was something that I hadn't, or skyscrapers as another example, something we, didn't see in Ithaca, but, there were other classes like History of American Architecture and other classes that did touch on those. So it's not like it was, out of nowhere. But at the same time, there was a lot to learn. So I think it just goes to show how, of course, context is so important when it comes, or, where you are is so important when it comes to studying or working in preservation, because, that's the same state, but vastly different types of buildings and materials and all of that, just between, Ithaca and New York City, just as an example. But of course, that plays itself out time and time and place again, all over the country and all over the world. So it's, very interesting, I think, question about whether the context in which you are studying, the local context in which you are physically based during your master's program in historic preservation, to what extent that may shape your thinking about, the rest, the world around you, and how do you sort of prepare yourself best to work in different contexts. So that, of course, speaks to the geography and architecture and elements. There's so much more to say about culture and people, as Maihar mentioned, and intangible, as Trudy talked about last night, and traditions and languages and values. So that can all be considered part of that local context. But I imagine that those things too they're going to shift and change and morph as you sort of move around. And then, climate being a big, of course, a huge issue now in urban areas and related to planning and preservation issues. That's another thing that I think is going to be just another part of context that's going to be more and more important, but yeah, and even is already, of course, but will continue to be more so. So I'll end there for now, and we can move on to the next question, I guess, unless Doug and Maihar want to jump in.
No, that's fine. Let's see the next one.
Okay.
You can start this one, Doug, if you want, and then you can continue to.
Sure. I'll just basically say this is kind of one of the questions that came to my mind when you first floated this idea, is whether or not there's really an alternative for any kind of preservation that isn't based in or isn't informed by local context, whether it's, again, geography or architectural history or culture, or religion, anything else. What would it even look like if it wasn't informed by that? And I was trying to think of what that might look like, but you can't really, in my mind anyway, if it was a domestic program that for some reason tried to be devoid of any kind of cultural context or any kind of historical context. Is
it even possible?
Yeah, I don't think it is. I don't know. I don't know how you would do that. I mean, anytime you're discussing a law, you're talking about something that has a specific cultural context, not to mention the geography that formed the place that made the law. So it really, in my mind anyway, it's really almost impossible to do that. You could certainly focus on materials science or something along those lines, but even that, whatever materials you study, those are going to be affected by how they're used. They're going to be a function of the culture that produced them. So you can't really separate that out. I think it's tough. I would have a hard time picturing a preservation education that was without some level of contextual specificity to the place where it's being taught. But I'm certainly open to ideas if anybody else has any other thoughts.
I think you're absolutely right, and the degree is of course different. But even if talking about material science, let's go back to my personal experience with clay type materials, right? When I was in Iran, clay and both baked and unbaked brick was part of the architecture, and preservation was mostly about brick. In El Paso, in this region, in West Texas, adobe is the same. So the nature of material is the same, but the way in which it was used is totally different. So even if we talk about material science, I think it's different, and I think the context is important. The way in which people used it, the differences in culture, in issues related to privacy, for example. It's totally different the way that people were using clay materials in US and in Iran, or in West Texas and in other part of the world. So I think it's even kind of impossible to think about a program that is absolutely disconnect with the local. But I also want to say that, of course, there are many national and international aspects to preservation that we all learn about in school and try to teach students again in the different programs. But even thinking about them, you need to like think about the local strategies and local analysis as well. Here I'm showing work of a very known architect in El Paso and in this region, Henry Trost. You may heard about him, but what he was doing, he's very famous and he did like lots of buildings in this region. But when you study his architecture, you understand that he was basically a businessman, and he was like learning about the architecture norm and trying to kind of replicate them here in El Paso or in this region. These works that I'm showing here, you can clearly see that he was kind of following the Chicago style or a work of architects who were like following those. And it's not his own architectural style, but it definitely has its own techniques of using concrete, for example. So although it's a style that was norm in that era in the United States, but for preserving his architecture, you need to like know his tweaks and his tricks and the way in which he was using material here in this region. So even for those things, it's impossible not to think about the local history. Emily, do you have anything to add?
Well, we should probably keep moving through. But one thing that came to mind was with this sort of counter question: what would an HP education that was not related to context be like? Of course, there's then the other side of it, which would be, but what if it was only local or regional? And I think that segues into maybe some of our next questions about the importance to potentially go beyond the immediate, so that you're feeling exposure to places and buildings and environments and ways of thinking in other places, which of course Cornell's HP program is certainly doing in its own unique ways. But okay, so the next question was, how does our teaching reflect the need to include or exclude the cultural and geographic context? What opportunities does it present? What does it add to the experience of our students? What are they able to do or not do as a result? How does emphasizing local and regional context serve or hinder the preservation movement as a whole? And I'll let Doug start with this.
Sure. There's a picture of a rock fence in there because that, in my mind, was the first thing that came to mind when we started talking about local context and local culture and being in Kentucky. You really can't talk about the Kentucky landscape or anything like that without bringing up the rock fence. So you got it, it's right there. So basically, I think, it obviously affects our teaching. It's the examples that we have at hand, it's the people that we know, it's the preservation issues that are presented to us. In a place like Kentucky, where we don't have anywhere near Cornell's global presence. Our focus really has been on cultural landscapes, because that is one of the things that Kentucky is well known for. And so that's one of the things that students do often kind of seek us out for. And that's become more of a defining feature in our program over the last really few years. But it's part and parcel of who we are. And honestly, I think that's a huge strength of, it's a function of how preservation programs have developed in the US, that we have so many that are spread so broadly across the country that they all teach students something that is relevant to the local context. And then it's not just a function of what one or two major preservation schools has to teach about a particular topic, because obviously a lot would fall through the cracks if that were the case. But I think because we have such a great diversity of preservation programs across the country, you do have schools that are able to teach about these different types of materials and architectural styles and other forms of cultural heritage. So I think it's it's great that we do generally include this content. Again, I don't know how well we could do it without it. But I think it's also a function of, it's a very diverse country with a whole lot of different experiences. And it's, one of the it would be a mistake, I think, to try to separate preservation education from that context, because you just miss out on too much.
But then the question is to which extent we want to like do that, as Emily was like saying. And let's say that if someone wanted to work on stone fences, is Kentucky the best place to do that because it's regional, or for other reasons students should like choose Kentucky University? So that's kind of like another question that we can raise based on this. And I should say that in terms of the opportunities that it presents for us as educators, I really like the way in which kind of Michael does this at Cornell, and so he provides all the basic information for everyone, and then let each student to work on the area that he or she wants to do. That area might be related to the context that Cornell is in, upstate New York, or might be in any a place all around the world. So if we can do that, that would be like the best. So provide all the necessary tools for the students and let them work on whatever they want.
All right, moving on. So this is a question that we hope we can get some conversation going around from the participants in the symposium, but regarding the growing number of international students, as Michael mentioned earlier, what do international students find most valuable or most useful from a US master's degree or PhD in preservation? And what are some of the best practices in incorporating international perspectives into a domestic Masters of Historic Preservation program? Yeah, the thing that came to my mind, I don't exactly know what the current state of Cornell's HP program is, and it has been a while. And I know that there's been increasing discussion about this. As Michael mentioned, it was starting in Ashima's class, which was the class before me. After me, that the international student body started increasing to such an extent. And so I know that I'm sure that there's been some very interesting conversations that have gone along with this shift, but I can't say I know exactly what they have been. From my perspective, in thinking back to, for instance, like the perspectives in preservation class, which was mostly sort of American or England oriented. I guess some France was in there as well, but definitely sort of Western oriented. So I don't know if that has changed or not, but if it hasn't, then well, anyway, I'm not exactly sure what Michael's been cooking up for the last few years in the program. I think I have some ideas given things that I've heard of in the past. But something that came to my mind was, just as Cornell has for the URS, the Urban and Regional Studies program, has their required courses of the American city and the global city. This just came to my mind in thinking about this, that there is we are teaching in the US, many of the students are going to go on to work in the US. It makes sense to emphasize the US context, to some extent, and all the intricacies of it, the laws and the systems and the history of it and the players and all of that. But if there could be a way to do sort of, and again, I may not be up to date, but if there could be a way to do sort of a landscape review of how preservation works in other countries as well, kind of a nuts and bolts kind of way, like in a similar way, like a practical discussion of how preservation works, or if it works, and to what extent, might be very interesting for countries around the world, as well as even for different cities in the US, because preservation is still a growing, changing, developing field. Cities are implementing new kind of innovative ways to deal with preservation, taking into account culture and taking into account social justice and LGBTQ and all these other fascinating things. And wouldn't it be great to get sort of a snapshot understanding of how preservation works in all these different cities, with different kinds of overlay districts and conservation districts versus, all of that. So that was something that came to mind. But back to the international, which is what this conversation is about. I'll pass it on to Maihar, and then maybe people in the audience.
So I would say that this is from my personal experience. So there are two different aspects. I mean, we talked about this with Doug and Emily a couple of days ago. If we talk about American, let's say, architecture history or preservation history or policies or all American preservation, then what about the student that's coming from another part of the world to US to get the study in historic preservation and want to go back to his or her own country? That's a fact. I definitely agree that we need to think about those things as well. But at the other side of the table, for my own experience, I studied architecture in Iran. I took many architecture history courses in Iran, and those were ranging from Iranian architecture history, Islamic architecture history, world architecture history, but I didn't necessarily knew about American architecture history. So when I took Mary Wood's American architecture history, I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed that course. So my point is, so there should be a balance between international, national, and local. So it's very important to make that that balance.
And I think just going back to the first part of the question too, just what's most valuable or most useful from a domestic master's degree. And I guess obviously that's going to depend on where a student winds up deciding to work once the degree is complete. So whether they stay here in the US or if they go head back home or head somewhere else. I would just be interested I'd be curious to know which parts of that educational experience do they find most useful. And it sort of fits into the conversation that we were having at the end of the last presentation, I think. But just what are the most valuable parts of that educational experience? Which parts are most, obviously it varies from person to person and from experience to experience. But are there any patterns that you can see there in terms of what students find most valuable, international students find most valuable from those US-based or US-focused programs?
So for me, Doc, for me that was learning to be kind of inclusive, being open-minded to new ideas or new policies or new rules or new techniques or new culture. So that was, for me, was very important and valuable.
If anyone else would like to chime in, this would be a great time.
Angela, why don't you reflect on the conversation I had with you about this discussion? Ritika can as well, because I've addressed this with each of you for very real reasons. The long and the short of it is that you have a limited amount of hours in a 2-year degree. The reality is that you have to make some choices. The reality further is that I regularly teach for the real estate program an international cases and contracts course, which covers a number of cities every year, and every year a different set of cities, because the economics and cultural context, the political context changes every year. So I will not address China in the upcoming year in the way in which I addressed China last year, right? But Angela and Ritika, perhaps it'd be good, and actually Kamalika can weigh in as well.
One thing I can point out is from our urban history class this semester, whenever we did speak about the different topics on urban history, there were always parallels drawn to India, to China, on the same topics, which helps us relate more to the American context. Secondly, talking about how this can be useful, my realization of this past 1 year has been that the US has a very sophisticated system and policy framework, which I did not find back in India. I think Ritika mentioned this in the chat yesterday, that we still follow international charters. So it's still, it's much more advanced to what we would ever study in a domestic master's degree. And it gives us so much more insight on what more our country can do with respect to historic preservation.
Any other comments from the audience?
Hi, I've just joined in. I've just logged in like less than 1 minute ago, so I'm not really sure of what the context of this conversation has been. But yeah, definitely when I make my own presentation in some time, I will be sharing some of these issues and viewpoints as well. On this, but I think as an international student who was at Cornell almost a decade ago, there are great valuable takeaways, which of course there are differences. We can't directly sort of transplant probably many of the things that we have learned there in the Indian context, but definitely as was mentioned earlier, there's so much, there's almost like a new parallel perspective which is operating in the US, which we are not looking at in India at all, because we're still so Eurocentric in our discourse and our view of preservation itself. So being in a US master's program really opens you and it knocks you on the head to look at it from a very, very different lens.
Yeah, I'll second Kamalika because first of all, it's been a great experience. Thank you, Michael, for this, because I can go up to him and tell him that, Professor, I want to study about climate change and historic preservation. And he said, yes, we can do it. So I don't think this kind of liberty I would have got in India. The way the program has been framed, I learned so much about documentation, and I'd already worked in India for about 11 years before I came here. So I had good experience in hand to understand what are the practical issues on site, what happens in India, and how the bylaws are being framed. But coming to US, you get a good vision of how laws are different than what they follow in India. Like, for example, we have different grades of building, like grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, so English laws that we follow, but that also give the liberty to architects in India to demolish the interiors of the building when they say that, internals can be changed. So it becomes more of a facadism and is not really understood as preservation. So I think that's a bigger issue that I've seen in India, and it's been practiced by really big architects. I don't want to name them, but the point is that when I came to United States and I started learning law here, I realized that, how channelized it is from federal to, state to local, and how these buildings, I mean, it's not like, there are different bylaws in different cities. Like, for example, in India, we have a different bylaws in Bombay, which has been followed. And in Delhi, when the government wanted to make changes in the Central Vista, they decided to change the law. So, and it just happens overnight. And that attitude, so when I came to US, I realized that, you can't really do that. and there's a difference in the political scenario, and there's a lot of things that you learn. I am currently working with a couple of other fellow colleagues in India on listing 20th century heritage. I was just, I sent it to Michael about an inventory I'd prepared using both Indian bylaws, US standards and European standards, to combine it to find gaps between what can be made an inventory form or 20th century. So I think that this part of the education has really helped me immensely, and I'm really grateful that I've been here for this. So thank you, Michael, for this.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think we need to wrap this up. Doug, Emily, do you have any last minute comments?
I just wanted to draw a quick note to Julie's comment in the chat section about about the Kootenai College with their associate's program in tribal historic preservation as being an example of something that emphasizes primarily the local preservation or the local context, which is a great example. So thank you, Julie.
So it is possible.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all very much for Doug and Emily to participate, and also for everyone else for the great comments.
Yes, thank you.